Yes, so Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. First of all, I would like to apologize that we have a all-male panel. It was not intentional. I did my best, but it was not good enough, and I stand corrected in my own misery. So, before you. I'm happy to see all of you, and I'm proud to moderate this side event that is addressing a theme that is particularly important to us about ending the stigma of drug users within the framework of human rights and drug control. Over the past few years, we made important experiences with regards to punitive policies and repressive practices against the people that we make our best efforts to represent. My name is Kenneth Aikander. I'm the Managing Director of RIO, a Norwegian Users Association in the field of alcohol and drugs. Today, there is a move in various countries across the world to reform their policies and to decriminalize and/or legalize illicit substances. These efforts and the debates are underpinned by both a need and a demand for human rights. We highly appreciated that the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights was so clear in his remarks during the opening session of this year's CND. We share his notions about the failure of the war on drugs. Every day, we witness the brutal consequences of this war for the people who use drugs, their families, and the local communities. And we support and promote all the measures that he insisted upon. People who use drugs have historically been stigmatized and marginalized. With decades of information campaigns, punitive policies, and quite frankly, discriminatory practices, it's important to, yes, change the policies, but also important to understand the underlying conditions that have resulted in these harmful practices. Most importantly, how to move forward and make meaningful change that lasts, which I hope we will discuss today. Stigmatization is often a prerequisite for discrimination, such as not receiving the same standard of services as the majority population, leaving people who use drugs to suffer from having limited access to help. People that use drugs can experience not being accepted on certain premises due to the group that they are considered as belonging to. Public authorities, governments, police sometimes even provide themselves with the liberty to infringe on their basic human rights. Sometimes this happens without the wider community, the group itself, or their advocates, like me, necessarily being aware that these actions constitute the violations of human rights. This might be due to the internalization of stigma, working to the detriment of the somatic, psychological, and social well-being of the people who use drugs. We see this, of course, as highly negative for our people, but also as a source of unsustainability for society that needs to be addressed. So, in order to address this topic, I'm happy to introduce our first speaker. He needs no introduction here. It's the Executive Secretary of the Pompidou Group from the Council of Europe, Denis Huber. Mr. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this, I think, important side event. Important because the topic is very important. Between human rights and drug control, possibilities and barriers for ending stigma for drug users. Maybe I will start with the barriers and then say something about the possibilities. The barriers, stigma has deep cultural and social roots. It influences how people see each other, but also how people see oneself. And this is also an important aspect of stigma. It can lead to self-stigmatization. When we have this situation, you mentioned access to health care, it's important, but we have also to address unexpressed needs for care treatment for those who are their own victim of self-stigmatization. Another aspect of stigma, which I think is very important, is that it rarely goes alone. It's often linked with other forms of stigmatization. For example, You may be a victim of stigmatization because you use drugs and because you're young. Because you use drugs and because you're old. That's maybe even worse. Because you use drugs and you are a migrant. Because you use drugs and you are belonging to a minority. We have recently organized the Pompidou Group in Warsaw seminar on the issue of stigmatization about drug use with Roma people. Also, the issue of children whose parents use drugs. The parents are stigmatized, but also the children. And I make my own publicity here. We have a special side event this week on children whose parents use drugs. Also, the issue of using drugs and being in prison or getting out of prison. So I think we have to, it's a very complex issue which has to be treated in a multifaceted way. Now, what can we do to address such an issue? The issue is complex, but the answer is simple. It makes sure that all people enjoy fully their human rights. Of course, it's easy to say, more difficult to implement. In the Pompidou Group, human rights is the main focus of our work. We have recently have adopted a new statute, which gives a new legal and political framework for the work of the Pompidou Group. It has been adopted in 2021 for the 50th anniversary, and it creates the main focus of the work of the Pompidou Group, human rights. Even more recently, we had a ministerial meeting in Lisbon, and it has been confirmed that a public health and human rights centered approach to more effective and human responses to drugs and addictions and related disorders is central to the work of the Pompidou Group. Another important issue, because when you want to make sure that people fully enjoy human rights, you have to work closely together with civil society. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm thankful for your invitation. In fact, human rights and participation of civil society are transversal issues for all the work of the Pompidou Group. And this is, of course, very important because civil society, they know what is happening on the field, and they can bring to us, which are a little bit further away from the roots, the problems, and we can try to find together the solutions. At the Lisbon Ministerial Conference, we have also adopted a new work program, which has 4 main priorities: promoting sustainable drug and addiction policies in conformity with human rights, safeguarding democratic societies by addressing addictions that impact human autonomy, protecting the rights of persons belonging to vulnerable and risk groups, and there we come to the subject with drug use and addiction problems, and finally, reducing the availability of illicit drugs and preventing the diversion of precursors. In the work program, there is a specific mentioning under the action promoting human rights and drug policy about creating opportunities to move from stigma to inclusion, because this is the challenge, moving from stigma to inclusion. We have recently also organized a seminar, which was called From Stigma to Dignity, Sharing Perspective, Mobilizing Potential. You can find the booklet on the Pompidou Group stand. That's my second page of advertising. And my third page of advertising is that we have a side event tomorrow together with Canada, because we have organized this workshop with the Canadian Ministry of Health, and also with UNODC and with CICAT, the Drug Commission of the Organization of American States. So I will just share with you the key messages of this seminar, and you will know more about it tomorrow. So the key messages were the importance of meaningful engagement, the need for continuous engagement with people with lived and are living experience in all aspects of policy and program development, legislation and regulation, and the delivery of services to ensure needs are met and unintended consequences are avoided. It is important, as I already said, to involve civil society in the policy program development stages. Civil society can and should actively contribute to policy and program development at the municipal, national, and international level. The idea that words matter and language is a powerful tool for reducing prejudice. Therefore, the language we use to describe substance use and people who use drugs must be non-stigmatizing. The concept of substance use health was introduced by one of our partners, the NGO Community Addictions Peer Support Association, as a new, inclusive, and non-stigmatizing way to talk about substance use and promote the health of all people who use substances. The understanding of human rights is being a central part of substance use policies. The determinants of health are important, and not addressing the underlying causes of substance use disorder may hinder the ongoing success of treatment and recovery. From a law enforcement and healthcare perspective, it is important to address the shaping of culture, viewpoints, and policies that institutions have on substance use, as these can create systematic barriers for people, we come back to the barriers, who use substances. Further, support should be provided for those in law enforcement and healthcare who may be dealing with substance use issues themselves. So these are only the key messages, and I invite you to participate tomorrow in the workshop that we are dedicating to this issue. And to conclude, I was speaking about isolation at the beginning. I think it's the big challenge for people who are victims of stigmatization, because human beings, we are social animals. We need interactions with other human beings, and isolation is the key risk and danger. And so I will conclude with John Lennon, who created a song called Isolation, and a quote: "I don't expect you to understand after you caused so much pain, but then again, you're not to blame. You're just a human, a victim of the insane."
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for your presentation, Mr. Huber. And I'm so happy that human rights is the main focus of your work. And I feel also at the CND there is a lot of focus on human rights, and we're very happy about that. So I will take some questions after the speakers are done. So we just move on to the next one. And he also needs no introduction here. He's the Senior Advisor at the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, Mr. Zaved Mahmood. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kenneth.
Yes.
And thanks also Pompidou Group and other co-organizers to organize this event together. And also I apologize for the male-dominated event for that. I should have noticed that one before and tried to help you, but
yes.
I this morning I noticed that this is all male panel. So I apologize for that as one of the co-organizers. Already Denis has set out that what is stigmatization and what are the barrier and solution also he provided. I would like to pick up only one issue, particular issue, that is barrier, criminalization, solution, decriminalization. Right. So it is very simple, that one. And I think that I am going to focus on that. What is the human rights framework of this argument? The decriminalization could help us. But let's see first, next slide please. Let's see first what criminalization does in the society. Criminalization of possession and personal use hinder the access to treatment, healthcare, and harm reduction services. Also, it is a barrier for blocks the access to control medicine needed for the palliative care. In many countries, still a lot of drugs not for medical purposes even is criminalized. Now we can see that cannabis has been regularized in many countries, but still many countries are not for medical purposes. So, and also we have noticed that the criminalization contributing to the prison population in the world. All over the world, it is not only global south problem, also in the global north, many countries because of the drug use, criminalization and all this contributing to the overcrowding in the prison. And also it increased the possibility of transmission of bloodborne diseases like HIV and other TB and other diseases in prison and also in outside the prison as well. So these are the evidence we have now. Just a different report came out from High Commissioner Office or even Human Rights Mechanism, and also a Council of Europe recently produced one report, a human rights-based study for drug reform process, which was led by Scottish parliamentarian Ms. Hannah Bardell. So that was very interesting report to look at, that how also in the European region this criminalization contributing to different human rights violations. Let me come to that point that UN entities within the UN human rights mechanism, different treaty bodies, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Committee, which monitored the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, then Committee on the Rights of the Child, the CEDAW Committee, which deal with the discrimination against women, and also Human Rights Committee, which monitored the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All of these treaty bodies has recommended for decriminalization for drug use. I would like to mention this one, particularly in Europe and in your region as well, Nordic region. All these countries has ratified these treaties, which I mentioned that one. So it is obviously they have the obligation under the international treaties to follow the recommendation or to implement the recommendation at the country level. Next slide, please. Let us look at the possibility of decriminalization under the 3 Drug Convention. It is very clear from, and also many countries, they have developed the argument that drug convention, they allow decriminalization for personal use for drugs. And it is, there is many other, particularly one provision mentioned in the convention, it is not here in the PowerPoint presentation, that the measures should be taken into consideration the constitutional law and national law in that context, and also context of the country. So from that point of view, that drug convention does not bar country to decriminalize for the personal use of drugs. And recently we have seen in Canada the legalization, and they have developed their argument on the basis of that provision. And also this morning I was in one meeting where our colleague represented the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy. In that guidelines very clearly mentioned that member states or countries may utilize the flexibility of the convention, drug convention, for regularize and also decriminalize the drug use. So there is a flexibility in the drug convention. It is important to use that flexibility for the decriminalization. I think this argument also put forward in the study or report which was produced by the Norwegian, it was parliamentary report.
It was a committee established by the government.
Established by the government. In that report also, I noticed that this flexibility of the drug convention was very highlighted and tried to move forward that argument for decriminalization. So that is important point to note, that drug convention allow the decriminalization. We are not going to violate the drug convention by decriminalizing drug possession, drug use. Next slide, please. Already I mentioned the different treaty bodies and what they have mentioned. Let me read out few committees observation or concluding recommendation. The Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights call on states to provide evidence-based harm reduction services instead of criminalization of uses. Here also the solution is that providing harm reduction services instead of criminalizing people, creating stigma, and more harming them. The Human Rights Committee, which monitored the another treaty, has called upon the state to provide appropriate health, psychological support, and rehabilitation for people who use drugs. These are the solutions we are providing. I'm just presenting you on those solutions. The CRC committee, Child Rights Committee, CRC is the Committee on the Child Rights, implores that state to consider alternative to criminalization of children that do not impede their access to treatment. In many countries, we have noticed that even children being criminalized, they're put in the prison, and it doesn't help to whole life, the scar that they receive, it continue in their lives. So it is definitely important that just for the protection of the child rights and their future as well, future generation, just decriminalization instead of criminalizing them, providing them support and helping them to move forward, that would be much better solution than instead of criminalizing. Please remind me how much time I have.
Yes. Yes,
And-
a little more.
Little bit more. And then CEDAW already I mentioned. Please, next slide, please. And also UN special rapporteurs, special procedure mechanism like special rapporteur on right to health, and other independent experts within the UN system also call for decriminalization. I don't want to go that one. Let us look at the regional body. Next slide, please. Regional body, including the European Commission and also Council of Europe, African Union, OSS, Organization of American States, and Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. All these regional bodies also nowadays suggest, recently they have come up with this argument that decriminalization help. This is the solution, not the, it doesn't help. Criminalization for people who use drugs. I would like to show you some national jurisprudence and what happened in the national jurisdiction and decriminalization. I think just one estimate shows that more than 26 countries, national jurisdiction actually had adopted decriminalization for personal use and possession. There are some examples over there on the screen: Armenia, Belgium, Chile, Czech Republic, also Switzerland, Portugal, and many other countries also from the global, few countries also from the global south. We can see that just this morning I was in an event where Ghanaian minister talked about their decriminalization, and also few other countries in Latin America, also Mexico, Colombia, and few other countries. Uruguay definitely, that all drugs are decriminalized. There are practices developing, so I hope that these practices, it would be good to collect and share with our different stakeholders, including government officials, and also what's going on in the globe. That would be important. With that note, I would like to mention a few more documents I think would be useful tool for all of us to look at. UN Common Position on Drug Policy, which we have discussed many times, but still I would like to refer that. Recently, there is another new UN Common Position has developed under the leadership of the Secretary General, UN Common Position on Incarceration. Particularly, we are concerned that criminalization is contributing to the world population, prison population, which I mentioned. One estimate shows that the 20% of prison population in the world now incarcerated just only for one set of crimes, that is drugs. So obviously, if we want to address the over-incarceration, we need to consider decriminalization. And also I mentioned international guidelines on human rights and drug policy. And just last week, in Geneva, 8 March principle on criminal law and human rights has been published. Our office, UX, our office and others, we have contributed to that, published by the International Commission of Jurists. In that principle, drug, not only the drug issues has been mentioned, the decriminalized, also other intersectional issues related to, for example, HIV, the decriminalization of that, sex work, decriminalization of that aspect, and sexual conduct, same-sex marriage or others, LGBT rights related criminalization, to decriminalize that. All these issues or practices which has been criminalized in the many part of the world, it has interconnection, as mentioned by Denis, that intersectionality that need to be addressed. I would like to request you to look all this document to look at and build your argument for your own government to pursue with them for criminalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Mr. Zaved. I think many advocacy groups like ourselves are very thankful for these very clear attitudes and messages coming out of the Office of the UN's Human Rights High Commissioner. It's very helpful when it comes to raising this discussion on a national level, that decriminalization is the solution to the problems with criminalization. So on that note, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, which is he's a lot closer to home, from the Norwegian Institute for Human Rights, which is a body organized under the parliament, have recently issued a very important report and involved themselves in the ongoing national debates about drug policies in Norway. So, advisor at the Norwegian Institute for Human Rights, Mr. Evind Digranes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, and sorry for being late. I was held up in the next door meeting room speaking at an event there. As Kenneth said, we at the Norwegian NHRI, we created or released a report last year on drug use and human rights. And the purpose of our report was to raise awareness of the states' human rights obligations, some of the states' human rights obligations in the field of illegal drugs, and assess how these are implemented in Norway. I'm not going to go into all of the details of our report right now, but it is available on our website, which is nhri.no, and you can also find an English summary there, which we recently released. And as part of our report, we had consultations with a number of civil society organizations and experts. I had a meeting with Kenneth, for example. And what was fascinating was that while they disagreed on many things, of course, there was one kind of common theme that almost all of them agreed on, was that people using drugs are stigmatized in several aspects of society. That was kind of very interesting to see how that came up in all these consultations. So Stigma also, of course, kind of became a central backdrop and a common thread in our report. We haven't looked at the causes of what we are looking at, the issues. We haven't identified the causes, and others might talk about that. I think it's safe to say that stigma is an important part of several of them, or plays a key role. So I want to talk a little bit about why stigma is relevant to human rights. I think that there are several kind of ways that stigma can impact human rights. One of them is that stigma fundamentally challenge human dignity. And I think that, and of course, human dignity is one of the building blocks for human rights. That's why we have one of the fundamental reasons why we have human rights. And in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the preamble recognized the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. And I think that a lot of people are using drugs, I cannot speak on behalf of them, but I think a lot of them have not felt part of this family. And so I think that fundamentally also impacts how you view yourself in society, and whether you feel included, whether you feel the dignity, whether you feel as a whole person. And without this human dignity, it also makes it harder to access basic human rights. The other area where stigma might impact human rights is that it reduces help-seeking behavior. So there are several indications that stigma and control measures can reduce help-seeking behavior among people using drugs, which can worsen their health conditions and therefore also reduce their access to health services. This can be fear of control, fear of marginalization, fear of retaliation. All this can lead to a willingness to seek less willingness to seek medical attention when you need it the most. So in that manner, the right to health can be challenged. But there's a third way also, which I think maybe has been partially overlooked, is that I think that there's also a danger of stigmatizing attitudes might lead also to discriminatory practices. We know from other marginalized groups that stigmatizing attitudes can contribute to discrimination. And as I said, we also this was kind of also something that came up a lot in our consultations. And I also want to mention a quote that we came over in our report, in researching for our report, a quote from a former quote from a training program at a somatic clinic at a Norwegian hospital, which read, "A drug addict will always try to manipulate everyone around them at all time." And so I think that, of course, this was removed in 2020. I would say that's quite surprisingly recent for an attitude like this. And it was removed when it was discovered. But I think that in many ways this exemplifies how addiction is viewed by many in society and also in health services. And I think that this can bring us to question what impact might this have on the health services provided. So this has brought us in the Norwegian NHRI to question whether there is a need for improved legal protection against discrimination for people using drugs. And we looked at practice the legal status both in international human rights law and also in the national context. And in international human rights law, there is little practice on this issue. However, looking at general comments from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, certain forms of drug addiction can be interpreted to have a legal protection against discrimination under other status. And I've also learned from the other seminar just now, as I understand it, that the committee is looking into writing a general comment on drug use and human rights. So if that is correct, then that is also very interesting. Correct, yes. And so we have looked also at the Norwegian national situation and the legislation in Norway. In Norway, people suffering from drug addiction can have some sort of protection against discrimination, but there's reason to question whether this protection is effective enough and whether it covers all groups, which should have that kind of protection. So that is some of the link. I'm going to shortly end now with maybe some ideas of how we can address stigma. And of course, I don't always have the sole solution to this. I think civil society also plays a big role in this, but I want to come with some ideas. I think that we need to acknowledge that use of punishment impacts our status or attitudes towards a group and contributes to stigma. There's no way coming around this. I think by punishing an action, it signals which actions we do not want in our society and indirectly also what people we do not want in our society. And so this is not a normative statement. This, I think, is a factual statement, actually. But whether or not, irregardless of what opinion one might have on criminalization or decriminalization, and this is kind of, I shouldn't need to say this, but human rights needs to be followed, even if drug use is criminalized, you don't lose other rights. It's interesting in the drug field where this idea that people using drugs do not have human rights is kind of lingered for a long time. And interference in human rights must have a basis in law, it must pursue a legitimate aim, and it must uphold the principle of proportionality. And it will also be interesting to see more work from international human rights bodies. I know that the High Commissioner has been focusing on this issue of drug use and human rights for a long time. That's very good, but I also think that we need to see more practice from UN treaty bodies and European Court of Human Rights. So I think it's very good that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights will focus more on this issue coming forward. Particularly, it would be interesting to see if there's more kind of developments in what the conventions demand when it comes to legal protection against discrimination. So I think I want to end it with that, and then it would be interesting to see if there are any questions in the end, if we have time for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Evind Digranes. I think I can say with full confidence that at least large parts of civil society in Norway is very, very thankful for the contribution by the Institute for Human Rights in Norway, and how this is evolving into becoming more like a human rights debate than it used to be before. So thank you a lot for this. And I will now move on to the next speaker. Is last but not least is my friend Gord Garner, and I have to look up the name of your organization, but you're Vice President for Strategic Partnership for the Community Addiction Peer Support, Capsa, from Canada. Mr. Gord, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And have you ever been in a situation when you're just around the corner and other people are talking about you? And so that's kind of how it felt like for me for a little bit, that I was here at the table. So that's a big change in things, right? I'm here at the table, not around the corner listening in. So I want to say thank you to all the other speakers. Thanks, Ken, for the invitation. I'm not part of the Canadian delegation. I live on Turtle Island in the country called Canada. I currently dwell on Algonquin territory that's unceded, and I recognize that, and I seek to learn from them about how to be appropriate in that situation. I've done a lot of harm to people in my life. I've been harmed a lot. I'm not very educated, so I won't have a lot of data or information for you, but I tell stories. And I've lived long enough and had enough experiences that I've learned a few things. And so I want to bring that to this table today if I can. And I guess I want to start off by just recognizing that I haven't had any substances so far today, and I kind of hope not to. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know the future. But that's me in my life. But a lot of people using substances seeking health care aren't seeking health care for their substance use. They've got a broken arm or pain in their stomach, or they got a headache that won't go away. And so they're not feeling any need for health care on their substance use. So we want to look at what that might feel like, and all the people out there, like most of the people, like almost all the people using substances, avoid healthcare systems without any idea of addiction or substance use disorder. The vast majority of people using substances don't have those conditions. The vast majority of those people aren't experiencing poverty. And so, well, they're in the room here, maybe you can't see them, but they're with us. Because the vast majority of people using substances don't identify themselves through their substance use. Those are terms and conditions that we've experienced through healthcare systems, through the only way we get to advocate, the only way we get to the table is I have to tell you about that. I can't tell you I've been thinking about human kindness and how we treat each other. That won't get me here. When I tell you I stole from my mom for 30 years, I'm getting you a little place to stand on, right? So that's all kind of sad, right? But it's that indebted thing, right? So we have these stories around the world. We have these stories, and whether they're mythological or religious or scientific, about once upon a time there was a beginning. And none of them had this piece where someone began and there was other people there. Right? So this sense of us, right, somehow dissipated over the centuries, the othering, right, in all kinds of forms and shapes. Right? I forgot to mention my pronouns are he, him. You know, these things matter. So my apologies for that. So this idea then is, if you're looking at stigma and discrimination, what you're looking at is fear. Why have we scared people? Why are they afraid of us? Whatever that is, that's created the discrimination and the stigma, it's about the other person's fear. Although we can identify many ways of addressing it, if we don't deal with that fearful society we live in, no one's going to change. It's hard to change your mind when you're afraid. And when you've been discriminated against or you've been mistreated, it's really hard to be kind to those who did it to you. And there's our quandary, right? How do we ask the world to be kinder to us in a quiet voice and still be heard? Well, I think part of that is recognizing that we're trying to bring comfort to those that are afraid. And many of us have a role here in our personal lives and in our professional lives to bring a sense of safety to others. Because when we feel safe, we listen. Feel safe, we can change because we don't have to be right. We have to recognize that people that have been mistreating us around the world have been doing it because they think they're right to. Can you imagine that, right? What's that about? I remember talking to a colonel from our country a few years ago here. And they have very harsh laws around people using substances. And he said to me, well, my nephew's using these things, and if I don't shame him, he'll keep doing it. And I, oh, so it's not that you don't care, it's just you don't know better. Kind of like my dad. Right? You know, stop that. You ever seen a parent when the child runs across the street? Is that a loving voice that you hear? And so, again, I go back to when we're afraid, right? This other stuff comes up, right? And I'm never afraid when I'm angry. I've never felt fear when I'm angry. It's a great comfort to many of us to be angry about this. But as long as we're angry, I'm not sure anybody else is going to stop being afraid of us. And so, like I said, I'm not very good at this kind of stuff. So can I share a little story with you? Is that okay? So I go to the grocery store every day, and I get a cart, right? And this is how like petty I am, right? Yeah, I'm only about 6 feet in, and someone's in my way. Because that's how my brain thinks, they're in my way. But they're not actually in my way, they're just buying groceries. They don't know I exist. Right? And then I get to the cash register, and you count the things on the basket in the 10-item basket line? Yeah, right? Yeah. You got 12 in there. They got 12 items in the basket. Someone do something about that, eh? And in a second, like I'm this little mini monster in the grocery store. And actually what's really going on is I have the privilege to be in a store where there's items to buy that I can buy and eat. And I'm with other people getting groceries so they can eat too. And I struggle to be peaceful with them. Why? Because I'm so hyper afraid all the time. And our society has developed this hyper fear. Right? Because of that, I can't consider the others. I can't think of that. They're just buying groceries. Nobody called them, hey, Gord's going to the store, get down there, get in front of them. That's not what happened. And so when we look at human rights, you know, we can go, okay, so it's like, be respectful. Won't hurt anybody. That when you talk to people that hurt other people, they'll tell you they had to do it because they were afraid of something. And they'll list off their fears. So I just encourage everybody that if we can't get everybody to stop all at once, right? Then maybe you can stop yourself in the grocery store tomorrow. Maybe stop fighting traffic if you want world peace. And the other thing is I made a deal with myself that if my dream comes true and there's a moment in my life where everybody in the world is being respectful to the person in front of them, my job's not to blow it and be the one person who isn't. So on a moment-to-moment basis, can I just check in and see if I'm going to be the person that blows the magic moment? The other thing is, because I'm raised as an ignorant person in a fearful society, I don't always know what I'm afraid of, because I think it's just what I know. And so I've had to learn things from other people and been wrong about a lot of stuff. Because I'm a slow learner, it's taken me a long time. So I hope you're a little sharper than I am. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Gord. Some very beautiful words. I think also when it comes for people like us, when it comes to the next step at some point about reconciliation, it's important to remember that some of these happens also with good intentions. People are afraid, and that's why we do the things that we do. So then we have moved through all of the speakers. I have 4 minutes left, so I think I might have time for 1, maybe 2 questions. So if there is a question, yes, you.
Yes, my question goes to you, Mr. Zaved Mahmood. In Norway, there has been largely, and I think this can be transferred to other countries as well, attempt to divide users into a binary system. You have the recreationals and the addicts. And a conservative policeman in a debate against Kenneth actually put it rather bluntly, said, we all agree that we should help the addicts, but why can't we stigmatize the recreational users? What's wrong about that? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the stigmatization of the recreational users and the role of that in sort of how does that affect their future? How does that affect their potential for becoming addicts in the long run? And is there any value in this binary system?
Thank you very much. First of all, from our office perspective, we do not use the word addicts. That I would like to exclude that from our discussion. That is really stigma, that as mentioned by Denis, that language matters. Language matters. This word addicts come with stigma and discrimination and all this. According to the different bodies, there's distinction needed for people who use drugs and people who are dependent on drugs. There is the 2 medical needs. One is the medical needs, that one. And people who use drugs, whether it is for the recreational purposes or any other purposes, we do not also want to say that there is a need for discrimination among them. But that identification of people who use drugs and people who are dependent is important for different type of medical services or harm reduction services and needed who are dependent for treatment, harm reduction service and all this. For programmatic purposes, that is needed. But when we are talking about decriminalization, we are talking about decriminalization any kind of use of drugs. So I don't want to make that distinction whether it is drug dependent or recreational or medical purposes and all these things. So from our human rights treaty bodies, as mentioned by our colleague here, that Economic and Social Cultural Rights Committee, CEDAW, and all human rights bodies, as mentioned, that it is, we don't want to make that, okay, this is decriminalize and not decriminalize this, but it's not our position. Our position, decriminalize for all use of drugs that I would like to mention that one. But again, I would like to highlight that language matters. Please do not use the word addict. Thank you.
Quick question and a quick response, yes.
Quick question. Hello, I'm from Scotland. I wonder if the panel agrees or not that key to dismantling stigma and discrimination for people with problematic drug use is viewing it first and foremost as a health condition.
Anyone would like to respond?
Gord, I think, yeah.
Sure. So we've developed a framework, a lens that we're building a framework called substance use health. And it's the concept, the idea that we're not debating whether people use or don't use substances, we're debating whether we're taking care of each other's health around the use of substances. And so a health framework is really important. The other things in terms of social uptake is there's a natural 50% increase in support for anything that's attached to health outcomes. People just go, oh yeah, it's for health, and go along rather than trying to explain complex policy issues to people that aren't involved in the day-to-day work. So yes, health.
If I may add with that, Minister, I was in your panel. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was in the morning there. It is really important that framing the argument from the health perspective, which I have noticed that in the National Collaborative Framework also that part has been taken. But also, we need to think about right to life. Yes, when there is a death because of opiate crisis or many other overdose-related issues, death, this is issue of the right to life. The Human Rights Committee, which monitored the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also I noticed that you mentioned in the morning, I think Alan mentioned that it will going to be in the Constitution, Human Rights Bill, or the international treaty. From that point of view, that Human Rights Committee mentioned that right to life is also obligations come for the state, duty to protect life. And duty to protect life in that context, it is important that the state take appropriate special measures to address the societal condition such as HIV prevalence or substance use. So it is from the both aspects we need to look at right to health as well as right to life from that perspective. I hope that my response was satisfactory to you. Thank you.
Just
very quick,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, I think it's important what you mentioned, the right to connect the right to health to the right to life, because the right to life is not only the right to survive, it's the right to have a decent life, and it brings us to the concept of dignity that you also mentioned before, I think, one of the speakers. And if I may do my fourth and last page of advertising. We have recently created a self-assessment human rights tool, and I think it's important for you as NGO and you as being head of the Institute of Human Rights in Norway, where states, member states, but also other actors, parliament, civil society actors, can check through a questionnaire in how far their drug policy is connected or not with their human rights obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights. And I think I would like to invite you to make use of this tool, because I think the results may be quite interesting.
Yes. Thank you so much. A round of applause for the panel.